So the nominees for the 2023 Game Awards have been announced. And similar to previous years, I will not be watching or putting any sort of attention whatsoever to this year's Game Awards, primarily for the same reason as previous years. The Game Awards is nothing but a popularity contest. It's only for name recognition. It only rewards games based on name recognition, primarily, usually. Now, with that said, this year is a bit different, and I do want to go down some of the, or at least go through some of the most popular categories, the most relevant categories, which includes Game of the Year. Scrolling down here, let's start with, I don't care about esports. Let's start with Best Fighting Game. So for this year's nominees, we have 5 different nominations here, starting with God of Rock. To be honest with you, I have no idea what the hell that is. They got a Nickelodeon game, which I believe that sounds familiar to me. I think this game was nominated in the same category in previous years. I could be wrong, it could be a different game, but I recall seeing a Nickelodeon fighting game in the best fighting game category in previous Game Awards nominees for previous years. Yeah, that's strange. And then Pocket Bravery, I don't know what the hell that is either. This is clearly going to be between Street Fighter 6 and Mortal Kombat 1. And if I had to choose, if I had to pick a game that actually deserved it, I would definitely go with Street Fighter 6. Not because Street Fighter 6 was like an amazing game. I thought it was a decent, fighting game, but because primarily it's the game that deserves it the most out of this category. Mortal Kombat 1 is a horrible fucking fighting game. There's a lot of issues with it. The biggest issue with Mortal Kombat 1 is the lack of content, primarily the lack of single player content, and then its online offerings aren't any better. It's just as bad as the last game, and in quite a few significant ways, it's actually worse. Not to mention the story mode wasn't worth a damn, and it's just sad that we have a year where there's a NetherRealm Studios game, especially a Mortal Kombat game that's released, and yet it has far less content than this year's latest WWE game. Like if you play WWE 2K23, that game easily has over 100 hours of content. Easily. The story mode alone, the My Career story mode, which has 2 different paths, a male path and a female path, both of those are 25 hours each, alone. Mortal Kombat 1, I was done with pretty much all the major content in that game by the 40-hour mark. Actually, well under the 40-hour mark. It hasn't gotten any better. NetherRealm, they've tried to do some damage control to fix invasions mode, and they've made some improvements to it, but it's still bad. Like, it's still not good. And then, like I said, there's no crypt. There's no real survival mode. The towers mode is lazy. The story is not good. Even the fighting system, which is largely improved over Mortal Kombat 11, has a lot of issues. Primarily because it, degrades the fighting system to whoever can get the first hit. And that's thanks to all the long combos that they have in the game and not enough, the studio not putting enough defensive options in there. I think, if I recall correctly, to get a combo breaker, it requires like a full meter, which is divided into 3 segments. That's absolutely absurd. But anyway, horrible fucking game. Not to mention all the DLC, the microtransactions and all that bullshit. It's just gotten worse. So Street Fighter 6, it definitely has some of the same issues that Mortal Kombat has, but it deserves it the most out of that category. So moving on, we have Best RPG, which includes Starfield, Sea of Stars, Lies of P, Final Fantasy 16, and Baldur's Gate 3. The only game I won't really comment on is Sea of Stars. Lies of P, I played the demo for Lies of P, and it's just a Bloodborne clone. it literally is just a clone of Bloodborne. Right down to a lot of the same animations and the behavior of the enemy AI. Just blatant clone. It feels like a game right out of 2015. And, that means it's pretty much outdated at this point. Very strange that game would end up on a list of best RPG games of the year. And then you have Starfield. Now, Starfield being nominated for Best RPG, I won't really say much against that because it is an RPG game, but Starfield is a game that doesn't deserve to win anything. That's one of the most underwhelming games that's been released this year, primarily because it's simply just another Bethesda Studios game. Like, it's just more of the same bullshit that Bethesda has been releasing for years now, for well over a decade and counting. So yeah, this is really the only major category that Starfield has been nominated in, and that's all it deserves, quite frankly. Final Fantasy 16. How this game got nominated for Best Anything outside of Best Soundtrack makes no fucking sense to me. Especially this category, Best RPG. Final Fantasy 16, one of the major issues with that game, in fact, the primary issue with it is that it wasn't even really a Final Fantasy game. What it was is a Devil May Cry, basically a cheap mimic of Devil May Cry with the Final Fantasy name plastered over it. And that's not deserving of Best Anything when it comes to anything that's related to genre conventions. The fact that this game got nominated for Best RPG just, once again, it proves what the issue is with the Game Awards in general. Definitely should not have been nominated for Best RPG because it barely has any RPG elements to begin with. Baldur's Gate 3, out of the nominations here, I only played a few hours of Baldur's Gate 3, but clearly this game deserves it more than anything else that's listed here. Now, I will say this, there's a major snub in this category that should have been nominated for this category, and that's Hogwarts Legacy. I would replace Final Fantasy 16 with Hogwarts Legacy easily, because Hogwarts Legacy, not a perfect game, but it did set out to accomplish it. It did so with flying colors, and that is a legitimate RPG. Final Fantasy 16 is not, by comparison. Yeah, rather weak category this year, but Baldur's Gate 3 is definitely going to take that. I don't see any other game winning in that category. And you have Best Action Adventure Game. There's some strong nominations here. I think every game that's been nominated for this category definitely deserves it. Now, I won't say much about Zelda because I'm not really a big Zelda fan. I only played, less than a handful of hours with Tears of the Kingdom. Not really big on the newer Zelda games, but as far as the other games go, Star Wars, Jedi Survivor, Resident Evil 4, Marvel Spider-Man 2, and Alan Wake 2, three of which, have been nominated in other more relevant categories, were all fantastic games, all of them. The game I think that deserves it the most in this category should be Marvel Spider-Man 2, if we're talking about best action adventure game. Yeah, and I really don't have a runner-up for that category. I think Spider-Man 2 should take that out of any other game listed here. Moving onward, we have best action game. Best action game. Now, best action adventure game is really different from best action game. There's a difference between the two different genres. An action game just is literally just an action game. There's not too many exploration elements that's involved like you have with these games. So it's more of a contained. We're talking about a game that's more contained in terms of its content offerings. Something more linear, basically, and just focuses on combat primarily. So that's the major difference between the action category and the action adventure category. Out of the games listed here, Armored Core 6, I think, is the one that deserves it the most. Primarily because Armored Core 6 was a very strong action game. From Software did make a few notable mistakes, which is, they make the same mistakes over and over with every game they release. But this one felt more focused than their other games, primarily because of the type of game that Armored Core is. It's not a RPG game like the Souls series. It's very much a self-contained experience. I think out of the games listed here, that's the one that should take that category. And moving onward, I'm going to skip best mobile game, indie game, independent game, community support, best ongoing game. Skip that. Games for impact, innovation. As far as best performance goes, personally, I think Melanie Liburd should take it for Alan Wake 2. And if not her, then probably Neil Newbon, for Baldur's Gate 3. I think it should be one of those two. But that's a toss-up category. It could really go to anybody. Moving onward, best audio design. This is a bit tricky for this category, but I think it should either go to Hi-Fi Rush or Dead Space. Alan Wake 2 had some fantastic audio design as well, but I think it should definitely go to Dead Space more than any other game. It's a toss-up between that and Hi-Fi Rush. Best score and music. This one is a bit difficult. I think it should go to Alan Wake 2, and if not Alan Wake, then Baldur's Gate 3. Final Fantasy 16 had a few, really good tracks, but you have to account the entire soundtrack, the entire score. I think it should go to Alan Wake for this particular category. As far as best art direction, I would give that to either Zelda or Alan Wake. Both games had fantastic, art direction. Liza P, I thought, had some really good art direction as well, but it was too reminiscent of the Souls games, and definitely too reminiscent of Bloodborne in particular. So it didn't feel original, in other words. So yeah, either Zelda or Alan Wake should take that. As far as best narrative goes, I would say it should go to either Alan Wake 2 or Baldur's Gate 3. If I had to choose just one, then I definitely would say Alan Wake should take it. What Remedy did with the narrative in that game is nothing short of amazing. It pretty much made the game, the storytelling that that they were able to execute. The game that definitely doesn't deserve to be here, once again, is Final Fantasy 16. Square Enix, they marketed that game to be a revenge story, and it turned out to be something completely different and something rather ridiculous. I mean, by the time, like more than halfway through the game, I got to a boss where they had giant monsters fighting in outer space, and the game is supposed to take place in like a medieval setting. I just wrote the game off after that. I'm like, this is fucking stupid. This is ridiculous. And that's the least of what was wrong with that game's story. Pretty much none of the characters in that game were developed to any significant capacity. The ending was just it was ambiguous, but what it hinted at was just like it made the whole thing pointless. I don't know how that game got nominated for best narrative, but it absolutely does not deserve it, and it absolutely will not win. Yeah, I can't say I'm too concerned about it. Moving on, we have best adaptation. Of course, these are either movies or TV shows that have been adapted for the big screen or the small screen, if you prefer. The Last of Us is definitely going to take that, and it should. That was a pretty good adaptation from HBO and PlayStation Productions. They did an amazing job at adapting the story. And they didn't just, they could have taken the easy way out and just adapted the story from the game, like beat for beat. But they, one of the reasons the show worked, and I'd say probably the primary reason it worked, is because it gave you a different perspective that the game didn't offer in many of the episodes. Now, it wasn't perfect. I didn't think that they needed to have an entire episode adapting the DLC with Ellie and Riley from the game. I thought that was unnecessary. And what they did with the Bill character, I thought definitely was worse than what the game offered. They completely changed his story. I preferred the game over the show when it came to that. And then what they did with certain characters like Sam, for example, being a mute in the show, in the game, he actually is able to talk. I don't know, that seemed like a very strange choice, off the wall choice that didn't make any sense. Yeah, overall, I prefer the game, but just as an adaptation, they did a pretty damn good job. I think that's going to take that category, and once again, it should. Moving onward, we have best game direction, and Alan Wake 2 should take this. Hands down, it should take it. Once again, Remedy, what they did with that game is just, it's mind blowing. They were able to reconstruct that entire IP, and they did it in the best way possible. Definitely, best game direction should go to Alan Wake 2, especially when you consider, like, when you factor in a lot of like the live action elements that they put into the game. Like no other game this year had that kind of creativity at blending together different entertainment mediums. For that reason alone, I think Alan Wake 2 should definitely take that. And then we have Game of the Year. Obviously, this is the big category, the most important category. Game of the Year has been pretty much underwhelming for the last 10 years. I think the last game that won Game of the Year that actually deserved it was 2013's The Last of Us. Literally every year since then, it's been nothing but bullshit on top of bullshit. And it all culminated in last year's winner with Elden Ring, which just fucking terrible. That entire game, and from software and their laziness with that whole mess. This year is very different. I think this is the best list of nominees that I've seen, again, over the last decade. As far as the contenders go, we have a Zelda game, we have a Super Mario Brothers game, we have Resident Evil 4, Marvel Spider-Man 2, Baldur's Gate 3, and Alan Wake 2. Now, as far as the nominations go, like I said, this is a fantastic list of nominees. I'm glad that Starfield was not nominated. Once again, that was just a typical Bethesda game. It shouldn't have been nominated for anything, quite frankly, but I'm glad that it wasn't nominated for Game of the Year because it doesn't deserve to be nominated for anything. And then you have Hogwarts Legacy, which also wasn't nominated. And Hogwarts Legacy is a great game, but it had a very lazy, by the numbers, open world, and the story wasn't very good in that game. It was very mediocre with the storytelling. The Harry Potter IP really isn't strong outside of the core story that is the books and the movies. Anything outside of that IP, that particular IP, just hasn't done that great. It really doesn't have much to offer outside of the books and the movies. So it didn't surprise me that the story wasn't that strong in that game. So I don't think Hogwarts Legacy deserved to be nominated. And then you also have Dead Space. Dead Space was fantastic. It's near flawless game, near flawless remake. However, I think the area where EA could have done a bit better is replayability. Dead Space didn't really have a whole lot of replayability, so I think primarily for that reason, it shouldn't have been nominated, and it wasn't nominated. So, as far as my favorite game out of this list, it's actually my favorite game of the year, is Resident Evil 4. Capcom did a home run with the remake, the Resident Evil 4. It's a damn near flawless game. And I've heard some really ignorant ass arguments against Resident Evil 4. One argument that was brought to my attention is that the ammo economy is worse than the original game. And it's like when it comes to the ammo economy from, between the original game and the remake, they're incomparable. You can't compare the two because the way the remake handles ammo economy is very different from the way the original did it. Most of your ammo economy comes from crafting, the new crafting system that they put into the remake. And the way Capcom handled the crafting system is fantastic because it gives the player more choice in terms of how they want to, utilize their weapons in their inventory. It gives you the freedom to craft, which ammunition for which guns you want to utilize. That's something that the original game didn't have. And then there were other strange criticisms as well, such as the game apparently doesn't give you enough ammunition. And anyone who's complaining about that just is basically shining a light on themselves. If you try and argue that Resident Evil 4, the remake, doesn't give you enough ammunition, that just says that you're not utilizing your ammunition. You're wasting all your ammunition, and you're not good at item management. It's really that simple because that game gives you plenty of fucking ammunition across all difficulty levels. I've played through the entire game multiple times. I got all of the achievements on PC, so that game gives you plenty of ammunition, plenty. You just have to utilize it properly. There were other weird criticisms as well, such as how all the weapons don't have the red dot sight that they did in the original game, and it's like you don't need that. The aiming is actually better in the remake than it is in the original game. You really don't need the red dot sight. It's useless. And then the strange one, I think the most prominent complaint was Leon moves too slow or some shit. And I'm like, that's strange because he's actually a lot more mobile than he is, than he was in the original. And it's not like the enemies move fast in that game. A lot of them, they just walk at a very slow pace towards, your position. And sometimes they'll do like a small, like, jog towards you and then they'll stop. And the enemies, they give you plenty of time to, properly aim, your weapon at them. Very, very strange complaint. And then they even put in the parry system, so it's like, that also offsets, being surrounded by enemies, so you don't even really need to flee from them like you did in the original. Like if you're surrounded by a group of enemies in the original game, you basically had to run away. In the remake, you could just utilize the parry system and knock them all down or stun them, and then you can run past them. Very, very strange complaints with the remake to Resident Evil 4. But I'm glad that it's nominated. It definitely deserves it. And again, that particular game is my favorite game the entire year. Then you have Marvel Spider-Man 2. And Marvel Spider-Man 2 is a great game, fantastic sequel, but Insomniac had quite a few missed opportunities in that game. The city of New York is not that engaging. Traversing through it is a lot of fun, like actually, exploring the city is great, but there's not really anything about the city that, itself that stands out. And a number of the side missions were extremely weak. In fact, some of the side missions clearly were put into the game for the sole purpose of forcing racial diversity. Diversity, I'm never going to complain about game developers wanting to put more diversity into their games, but if it's forced, you can tell when it's just put there for no other reason other than we got to have a character that's gay. We got to have a character that's deaf. We got to have a character that's black. It's like, come on. If you're going to do that, make it relevant to something that actually, happens in the story or something like that. Same issue I had with The Last of Us Part 2, because that game had forced gender diversity. So, I think those few things, hurt it in the end. So I don't think Marvel Spider-Man 2 definitely deserves a nomination, but it doesn't deserve a win for this category. So I think this is going to be between Alan Wake 2 and Baldur's Gate 3. If I had my choice, I would give it to Alan Wake 2 simply because of how different that game is and a number of the creative decisions that went into it. But I think that Baldur's Gate 3 is going to win Game of the Year this year. And I wouldn't say it doesn't deserve it. I think that game provides a lot of freedom, a lot more freedom than other RPGs, other contemporaries within its specific genre. Primarily for that reason alone, just given the different options and the different paths that you can take in the story, I think Baldur's Gate 3, is probably the likely game that's going to take the award. All of these games, I think are deserving of, a Game of the Year nomination. Whatever wins, I'm not really going to have much to say, but I think out of all of them, once again, if I had my choice, it would be Alan Wake 2, and that's despite the fact that my favorite game this year was the Resident Evil 4 remake. But I personally believe that a remake, no matter how good it is, should not get a Game of the Year win simply because it is a remake to something that came out years ago. Like I said, if I had my choice, it would be Alan Wake 2 that would get the win, but I think it's going to be Baldur's Gate 3 in the end. Those are your nominations for the 2023 Game Awards. We'll just have to wait and see, what the winners are when they're announced. And I'm very curious to know what the new games that are going to be announced, what those titles will be, and from which companies, because they always have, surprise announcements for, this award ceremony. The ceremony takes place, the show takes place on the 7th of December at the Peacock Theater in Los Angeles, California. I won't be watching the show, but I will be watching the some of the highlights that come out. I'll be paying attention to that as well as the winners when they're announced.